What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the first person shooter tutorial series, we're going to be going over giving different damage amounts to different weapons. So in our game to date, we had the ability to shoot an opponent with either a projectile or a raycast or line trace and deal damage. And when we did that, the enemy would take a specific amount of damage shown here in the health bar, but that damage would always be hard-coded, and so each weapon was doing the same amount of damage. In today's episode, we are going to go through and add damage amounts for each weapon, as well as headshot or weak point multipliers for each weapon. So you'll see that the SMG here does a lot less damage than something like the blaster will do. So if I switch to a different weapon, I do more damage by one bullet than I do with like 10 bullets of the SMG. Let's reload this. We'll start everyone at full health and we'll show a side-by-side. So a body shot from the blaster here does that much damage. I believe the actual number is 15% of the total health, but really doesn't matter so much. Just know that that's one weapon. This is the Kingslayer weapon. We do a body shot here. You can see it clearly does less damage. Comparing them side by side, the blaster had done more damage to the character on the left than the Kingslayer did to the character on the right. Now we also have the bruiser, which is the SMG, and you can see it does even less damage than that. Now this works the same for the weak point modifiers as well. So if I come into the game one more time and let's land headshots. Headshot with the blaster does that massive amount of damage. With the SMG does that amount of damage, a little bit more than the standard. And with the Kingslayer, it does that amount of damage. So the modifiers are different depending on the weapon. The blaster got a huge increase from the headshot modifier, while the SMG got a smaller increase from the headshot modifier. And then the Kingslayer was about double. It was pretty good, but not too small, not too big. You can see those differences right here. Alright, so that's what we're going to be covering today. Before we hop into this, if you want to get caught up in the series, you can click on this iCard in the top right corner right here and check out all the episodes in this playlist. You can see how we created our switching weapon system, our interaction system, our raycast and projectile system, all that good stuff, and a lot more. If you don't care about that, but you care about the damage being assigned to your weapon, then I do recommend you watch this episode right here. This is where we went over initially setting up the damage, so when we hit an opponent with a line trace, we deal damage, or when we actually shoot them with a projectile. If you're interested in getting this template for free when it comes to the Epic Marketplace, feel free to check out the Patreon page I've got right here in this iCard. Show you all the benefits you get for supporting me on there. As an early bird supporter bonus, you will get this template for free when you subscribe to those tiers once it is released on the Epic Marketplace. Alright, with all that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started on the actual content for today's episode. And this is a code and blueprint tutorial. So we're going to go to Visual Studio for a project. And I'm going to go to my base weapon.h. This is what my parent class is for all my weapons that I have in the game to date. If I scroll down this file, I'll get to my variables, and in my variables I have certain things like how much total ammo we can hold and the current clip ammo. In here I want to add variables for damage and the weak point damage multiplier. So the damage is the base damage of the weapon. Note that this can be adjusted in the future. Perhaps you have the ability to upgrade your weapon so you can increase your damage. So this doesn't have to be a flat rate that never changes, but we still need to track it one way or another and set it to a default value when we acquire the weapon. So I've made a float variable called damage, and it is a float in case you want to do decimals or percentages. Say the enemy has 10 health and you do 7.5 on a shot, then you'll want that to be a float instead of an integer because it is a decimal. So I've got float damage, and it is uProperty edit anywhere blueprint read write with a category of weapon. This just means that we can see it and edit it in the blueprint, and I've given it the category of weapon, which doesn't really matter here because all of my variables are a category of weapon in this file currently. So this is just for organization. We know what to look for to get this to show up. And then additionally, I made another float variable, which is called the weak point damage multiplier. I didn't want to call it just the headshot damage multiplier because if you are fighting a monster that has different weak points, or just an enemy in general that has different weak points, not the head, I just want to call it weak point. So this is the weak point damage, and it's a multiplier. If you want the weak point damage to always be the same, you don't have to make a multiplier, but I'm making a multiplier because it's going to take the base damage that the weapon does, and it's going to be multiplied by this multiplier. You can play around with the weak point damage multiplier so that you can have a weapon that does less damage on the body and more damage on the weak point. You might do 10 times as much damage on a weak point as you do on the body for one gun, but then only 1.5 times as much damage on a weak point than you do on the body for another gun. And the comment here says base headshot damage multiplier of the weapon. Really? I'm going to change that and say the base weak point damage. So there we go, and this has the same U properties so that we can edit it and see it in the blueprint, as well as the same categories so they are organized together. Now I'm going to go to my base weapon.cpp and go into my constructor, which is where we set all of our default values. In here, I want to set my damage and weak point damage multiplier values. These are my defaults, and they will change per weapon, but I still want to set them to a value starting out. So my damage, I put the 15.0F. Again, it's just an arbitrary value that I picked. You could pick 1.0. You could even pick 0.0 if you want. Now, weak point damage multiplier, I set to 3 by default. So essentially a headshot on that zombie, his head is his weak point, that will do 3 times the amount of damage as the base damage of the weapon. So we would end up doing 45 damage on that shot. Now, once you have these variables in here, we can go back into the editor and we can go into our individual weapons. So I'm going to go to where my weapons are. I'm going to go into each one. So I have my base weapon BP, which is just my blaster, the default blaster in Unreal 4 and Unreal 5. And in here, we can click on class defaults to open up all the details about this weapon. And you'll have your damage and weak point damage multiplier right here. And you can change these values to fit the values you'd expect. So if you want it to be higher damage, change this to a higher value. If you want it to be lower damage, change it to a lower value. And same with the weak point damage multiplier. Remember, these are going to be multiplied together, not added. So if I want this to be 4 times as strong on a weak point, then damage would be 15, but weak point damage multiplier would be 4.0. And we're going to do this for all of our weapons. So I have my assault rifle. You don't have to open the full blueprint editor because I don't have anything in here, but I'm just showing you. That's this gun right here. And in here, we have damage and weak point damage multiplier as well. You can see I have adjusted this one. In the base weapon BP, I had the defaults that I had in the constructor, and I just left them alone, so they have those same values. But in my assault rifle BP, I changed the damage to be 7.5, which is half of what the blaster does, and the weak point damage multiplier to be 2.0. So on a weak point shot, the damage will do 15, whereas that's the base damage of the blaster. Now, my last weapon that I have right now is my submachine gun. And it looks like this. And for this, I had damage of 5.0 and a weak point damage multiplier of 1.5. So you can see how overpowered the blaster is at the moment, but really all you need to know is set your damage and weak point damage multipliers to the values that you want to use for that weapon. Of course, you can change it as much as you'd like, so play around with it until you get the value you want. Now, after we have those values set up, we need to actually pass this along to the enemy taking the damage once they are hit by the projectile or by the line trace or ray trace that we spawn from the weapon. Since we have weapons with different types of collision, we need to account for both of them. And if you've been following the series, the enemy already has a take damage function that we set up, and we already use it. We just need to pass the correct data along to it. So the first case is the projectile. That's what the base weapon BP does. It actually shoots ammo out of it, and that ammo collides with the enemy and then deals damage to the enemy. So in here I have these different ammo types. These are the actual projectiles we create and spawn from the weapons. And I have one called base ammo BP. It doesn't technically have a mesh on it because we actually use the children classes. The base ammo BP is the wrapper class, basically just meaning it holds the logic. And then we define the parameters and the mesh on the child classes. So my base ammo BP is where all the ammo types, all the projectile ammos have collision. And in here, we were looking to see if we overlapped with the static mesh, and if we did, if it belonged to the base enemy BP. So basically any enemy in the game. Then if it does, we check to see if it was against the regular collision box or the weak point hurt box. The collision box is the standard hitbox of the enemy, so we shoot them anywhere, we'll collide with the collision box. The weak point hurt box is what we specified in earlier episodes for headshots or other weak points where we can deal more damage. And so if it's the regular collision box we collide with, we do the standard damage. And if it is the weak point hurt box we collide with, we do the headshot damage. So we play different effects currently. And then we were calling take damage with a hard-coded value. I believe I used 0.1. And I destroyed the projectile, the base ammo BP. If it was the weak point, then we called take damage, and I believe the value I used was 0.3, and I called destroy actor on the base ammo BP. Now I've changed it. Instead of just hard coding it, I've added all these nodes right here to calculate the appropriate damage. So this projectile, this base ammo BP that is spawned, gets spawned from the weapon itself. If we look at base ammo BP, go into the event graph, and come to fire weapon, we determine if it's a projectile or hit scan type weapon. If it's projectile, we spawn projectile at the correct spot, either at the crosshairs using the ADS camera or at the crosshairs using the first person camera component. In this function, the spawn projectile at crosshairs, this is where we actually create the projectile and determine the type of ammo to use. When we do this, we set the owner to be self, which is the weapon that spawned it. So the ammo belongs to the weapon. So we can check the owner of the weapon and grab the damage from the weapon to determine how much damage we should actually do. So in our base ammo BP, we're going to call get owner. Then we're going to cast and see if the owner is a weapon. So basically cast the base weapon or cast the base weapon BP. It doesn't matter which one you pick here in this case. So we can use base weapon BP. And if it is, this means that it is one of the weapons we have of the base weapon BP class. At this point, we can drag off of the base weapon BP to get our damage variable that we just made. Now there are a few things in here, but you just want the get damage. And then you can go ahead and call your take damage function on the enemy that was hit by the projectile. So you see I have this enemy that we casted to at the start. That is the owner of the mesh that was hit by the ammo, by the projectile. And we were calling take damage on that enemy. We can still do the same thing, and we can still call take damage on the enemy, just like we have been doing. But instead of a hard-coded value, we're going to pass in damage. Now, if we just do this, it's not going to work. Technically, it will work, but it will absolutely just kill the opponent right away. In fact, I'll just do it. So let's say I come into my game here, and I hit this guy. He is just absolutely dead. That is because this weapon is way too overpowered with his current logic. The player health is actually on a scale of 0 to 1, because those progress bars that we have on the enemies, the thing above the enemies' heads, I go into the base enemy BP. This progress bar is a ratio of 0 to 1, so their player health is a value between 0 and 1. The damage that I have chosen for my base weapon or for my blaster is 15. So if we take away 15 of their health, we're basically taking 15 times their health every time we collide with them. We're killing them 15 times over. But this is a simple conversion. We think of 1.0 as 100%. So if the damage of the weapon is 15, we want it to be 15% of their health on each hit. And so that means if we multiply float times float by 0.01, and then pass that into the damage. We will then change the scale to fit within the scale of the enemy's health. And now we will do 15 damage per shot. So you can see the math is working logically. If you're counting, that is the correct number of hits to kill them, doing 15 damage per shot. So that's why we do that logic there. And that's what we have right here. Make sure that you still destroy the base ammo BP afterward, because that projectile is now used. Now, the other case here is that we hit a weak point hurt box, so basically a critical hit or headshot. And we want to do essentially the same thing we just did, but the calculation is different for the actual damage amount. So we still want to get the owner, we still want to cast it to the base weapon BP, and we still want to grab the damage off of it as well. But we need to factor in the weak point damage multiplier. So we're going to grab our damage. And we're going to grab our weak point damage multiplier. And we're going to multiply them together. But remember that the scales are still off, just like they were for the one above. So we need to also multiply it by 0.01. And you can actually add a pin by pressing this right here. And just add it in and get it done in one node, and then pass that result into the damage. And then make sure to destroy the projectile afterward. And now this is the logic for the projectiles for the damage on each weapon. But we also need to take into account the hit scan weapons. So let's go back into base weapon BP, and let's go into create ray trace. It's a function that we made earlier. This is what we spawn if the weapon was fired and it is a hit scan weapon. So we go into create ray trace. We basically create the line trace or the ray trace. And then we determine if it hit anything. And if it did, we check to see if that thing that it hit was a base enemy BP. At this point, we check the same things we did before, although we actually check them in the opposite order. So we check to see if it was a weak point hurt box that we hit. If it was, that's our critical hit, so we spawn the corresponding effect. If it's false, that it wasn't the weak point hurt box, we spawn the regular damage effect. So this time the top section is for the critical hits and the weak points, and the bottom section is for the standard damage. So we're going to use the same logic that we did in the other file for the projectiles, but it's actually a little bit easier because we are already in the base weapon BP. We don't have to worry about the ammo. The weapon is spawning the line trace. So we can just grab the damage of the weapon, get damage, and we can multiply it, float times float, by the weak point damage multiplier. Then we can multiply that by 0.01 to get it in the same scale, and pass that into the take damage function call. This one was just 0.3 before, and now it is this. It is this actual calculation. Now, if it is not a critical hit, we go to this section right here, and it was just 0.1 before, but now what we really want to do is get our damage and multiply that by 0.01. Then pass that into damage. And there you go. Once you do that, you will have all your possible needs, projectiles and hit scans, met for your different damages on your weapons. So now you can shoot them and get the appropriate response. That is 15 damage from the blaster, as it should be. A headshot does more. It does 45 damage, and that's exactly how much we did. Now let's switch to the bruiser. So on here, it does 5 damage per shot. It's hard to tell because it's a small number, but it looks pretty accurate. And you can see it's pretty accurate. I missed a few bullets. It took about 20 bullets to defeat him. Now the headshot, the multiplier is 1.5. So doing this, you see it does damage a little bit faster. And that also seems about accurate. Then we go and get our hit scan weapon. And it does 7.5 damage on a shot. So it should be half the blaster. But hitting them in the weak point will do double that. And so it should take the same amount of shots that it took body shots for the blaster to defeat them. And you can see that is perfect. So all of our damages are working for both the standard and the weak point versions, and projectile and hit scan versions as well. And at this point, guys, you can set up your weapons that have their own damage and weak point modifiers. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider joining the Patreon, which I've linked right here. Mentioned it earlier. You can check out all those benefits, like getting these templates for free once they're released on the Epic Marketplace. Other than that, guys, if you need assistance, please feel free to join the Discord community. There's a link in the description. It is completely free, and I would be happy to help you. But otherwise, guys, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.